On June 24, 1346, the people of Sicily first noticed something was wrong. Ships arriving from the east had brought with them what would become known as the most devastating plague in human history. Historians will debate how exactly it arrived, but all accounts agree that once it began spreading, there was no hope of stopping it. Within a few short years, it would kill millions and alter the course of European history forever. This is the story of the Black Death. The first recorded cases appeared in October 1346 at the Sicilian port of Messina. But for the next 6 months, there seemed to be no cause for concern. Only one ship was visibly carrying diseased rats, but they soon seemed to disappear after reaching land. So nobody paid much attention when some people began dying in the city. By April 1347, though, it became clear something was very wrong. Throughout the summer, more ships arrived from Asia, and each one carried more disease. As these new ships unloaded their cargo, rats would flee onto the docks and then into the surrounding areas, bringing death with them. And yet still, the people of Sicily were unprepared for what was about to happen. In hindsight, it's easy to see that this was no ordinary sickness. Those who fell ill suffered from bubonic plague, a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This is spread by fleas that have made their home on rodents, such as rats. It causes fever, chills, weakness, pain, and swelling around the lymph nodes, which can grow into large, painful swellings called buboes. The plague has 3 main forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Of those, the bubonic form is the most common and the one that tends to leave survivors with lifelong health issues. Pneumonia is the most deadly, causing massive bleeding in the lungs and a high mortality rate. Septicemic is as bad as it sounds, causing massive bleeding throughout the body. To make matters worse, there was no effective treatment for any of them. Nobody knew what caused the plague, so there was no way to treat it. To learn more about how these tiny bacteria could do so much damage, we need to go back to where it likely originated. Many historians believe the plague started in Central Asia. It's likely that the source was the Oriental rat flea, which had found its way onto trading ships, traveling from here to Sicily, and eventually making its way to every other part of Europe. Unfortunately for humanity, this plague would not be the last time these fleas would travel along trade routes and infect unsuspecting populations. We know from Chinese and Arab records that outbreaks had been happening since at least the 6th century. But the Black Death was different. It killed faster and more efficiently than any outbreak before or since. And though it took years to reach England, France, and Germany, it was unstoppable. In the mid-14th century, Europe was home to approximately 75 million people. Within just 2 years, somewhere between 30% and 50% of them would die. In some places, entire communities would be wiped out, leaving villages abandoned. Others suffered only a slight reduction in population. Overall, the Black Death killed around 25 million Europeans. Though historians have tried to downplay the impact of the plague, claiming that record-keeping was incomplete and some countries weren't as badly hit as others, the evidence shows it was far worse than anyone thought. In reality, there wasn't a single place in Europe that escaped its effects. It first arrived in England in June 1348, making its way north from the coast. London was particularly hard hit, but nowhere was safe. On July 18th, the prior of the Tower wrote to the city's sheriff about the growing crisis. The ground where people were buried was quickly becoming exhausted. They needed another place to bury the dead. There were so many corpses they couldn't keep up with them. He requested that an old gallows be set up near the church of St. Mary Spital and used for hanging the bodies until they could be buried. This grim task was given to one Roger Keepentingen, a man already infamous for his association with criminals and prostitutes. He later earned the nickname the Hangman because he spent his days hanging plague victims and burying them overnight. Other than the introduction of the plague itself, this was the darkest day for Londoners. As the weeks passed, the number of deaths increased. By August, the cemeteries were full and the authorities decided to move the burials to a piece of wasteland outside the city. Many people began leaving London in hopes of finding safer accommodation in the countryside. But they too were struck down and died. Soon enough, the whole country was in chaos. Some turned to religion for answers. At first, Pope Clement VI blamed the killings on Christians who had converted to Islam. When that didn't help, the Pope took the more logical step of launching an anti-Jewish massacre. Jews were blamed for poisoning wells and using blood libel against Christians to spread the disease. Entire communities were wiped out in some places. The slaughter continued even after the Pope realized these claims were false. It was too late. Once people believed something, it didn't matter if it was true or not. But while the Black Death was taking lives across England, nobody was doing anything to stop it. In fact, nobody had any idea what to do. Many people simply fled, leaving the sick to fend for themselves. Some sought shelter in monasteries, hoping God would protect them from infection. For a while, this worked. But soon enough, monks and priests were dropping like flies. Others chose to fight back. The flagellants were bands of men who walked around cities beating themselves with heavy leather straps. They claimed that God was punishing the world, and the only way to stop the plague was for them to show penance. Eventually, this bloody-minded devotion caught the eye of the church, which began organizing processions of flagellants around the country. These groups grew rapidly, attracting followers from all walks of life. But even their good intentions could not stop the Black Death. It's important to remember that the 14th century was a very different time. Most people were poor and illiterate. Medical science was almost non-existent, and people believed diseases were punishments from God. These attitudes meant that nobody knew what to do to stop the killings. It's also worth remembering that though we now live in a modern world, we don't always make better decisions. In the face of the Black Death, some people did try to escape. For example, the town of in Suffolk built a wall around itself to keep the disease out. Unfortunately for them, a few people snuck through a hole in the wall and infected the entire population anyway. Others tried to avoid the disease by changing their diets or using herbs, but nothing helped. Over the next few years, the Black Death would strike again and again. People were never able to fully escape it, and it stuck around until the 17th century. Though the worst outbreaks occurred during the 14th century, there were many more to come. In the end, it seems the only thing that stopped the Black Death was the fact that people kept moving around. As the disease spread from person to person, the dead were often left lying around for weeks on end. This meant the fleas and rats that were carrying the disease could breed and spread the illness even further. If people had stayed still, the plague could have taken even more lives. So why is the Black Death so significant? Why did it change Europe forever? Firstly, it reduced the population massively. This meant there was less demand for things like food, housing, and labor. In turn, this led to major changes in the economy and society. The Black Death also contributed to the decline of feudalism. Feudalism was a system in which peasants farmed land owned by a lord in exchange for protection. The problem was that with so many people dying, farmers were in short supply, and lords suddenly had nobody to work their land. This forced them to pay higher wages or risk losing their farm. In some places, serfdom was even abolished entirely. It also gave rise to new industries. With so many people dying and new jobs becoming available, people were willing to take on more dangerous professions. Mining, for example, became more popular as people saw little risk in risking their lives since so many other people were dying anyway. Finally, the Black Death changed the way people thought about science and medicine. Before the 14th century, most doctors had little understanding of the natural world. They believed illnesses were caused by an imbalance of the four humors, or fluids in the body, and that the best treatment was to balance them out with bloodletting. However, after the plague, people began to question these beliefs. New ideas about anatomy and physiology started to emerge, and this led to major advancements in medical science over the following centuries. The Black Death was a catastrophe, killing millions and changing the course of European history forever. But without it, who knows when people would have begun questioning traditional practices and ideas?